Where did civilization in the world first appear? The generally accepted view is that the first urban society, and that's usually what is meant by civilization, popped up in southern Mesopotamia around 3700 BCE or so, the first known city being Uruk. But there are some who take issue with this view. I would go so far as to say they are offended by this view. They claim that India, not Mesopotamia, was where world civilization began. We in the West don't often hear about this view because most of its adherents are, as you might guess, based in India. It's very much linked to Indian nationalism and Hindu fundamentalism. But here we're going to examine the views of David Frawley, who himself is not from South Asia, but he is a convert to Hinduism, and his views reflect the teachings of Hindu sacred texts and traditions, which suggest that South Asia is where civilization began. Specifically, we'll look at a talk he gave called The Myth of the Aryan Invasion in India, the video of which to date has garnered over 360,000 views. Do his arguments for Indian priority hold up to scrutiny? Let's find out. Myths of Ancient History is aimed at dispelling common misconceptions about the past. If you're interested in ancient history, lost civilizations, and secrets from Antiquity, I encourage you to pause this video and subscribe to the channel, because you will get plenty of that kind of material. And if you find this particular video valuable, please hit the like button and comment below with your favorite takeaway. And feel free to ask any clarification questions that you may have. David Frawley is an American Hindu spiritual teacher who promotes astrology, Ayurvedic medicine, yoga, and New Age spirituality. He knows a lot about Vedic teachings. His view of history, in fact, is derived from the Vedas. And as far as he is concerned, all data garnered from archaeology, historical research, linguistics, geography, anthropology, and genetics must be brought into harmony with the teachings of the Vedas. The video, The Myth of the Aryan Invasion in India, features a talk delivered by Frawley for the organization India Inspires. According to the group's own website, their mission is to, quote, help seekers get a better understanding of Indic civilization, unquote. And that includes the belief that India had the first civilization, the first accumulation of material wealth in the world, and that the science and philosophy of other world cultures can be traced back to India. Moreover, India, quote, maintained civilizational continuity through the ages, unquote. What that means is that it was not influenced by foreign ideas. Frawley's talk very much promotes these claims, and this is why Frawley takes issue with the idea, held by most historians, that the composers of the oldest Indian sacred books, the Vedas, were migrants that came into the Indian subcontinent from the West in the 2nd millennium BCE and their descendants. In his mind, that diminishes the exceptionalism of Indian culture. The organization India Inspires encourages civilized debate, so I present this video in that spirit. His talk is long, and for the sake of time I cannot include every single thing he says, but I will do my best to make sure I don't quote him out of context, and you can check the original video to verify I am not misrepresenting his arguments. I'll leave a link to it in the description below.
One of the greatest discoveries in modern intellectual thought was around the 18th century, when scholars in Europe discovered that their languages were closely connected to the Sanskrit language. The Sanskrit language was an older and more sophisticated language than the languages they spoke. Not only the modern Slavic, Germanic, Romance languages, but the older Greek, Latin, Celtic, and even Persian languages. So confronted with that, some of them felt that Sanskrit was the mother of all languages, and India was the mother of civilization, or even of what could be called Western culture.
Frawley begins by mentioning that scholars once believed that India was the mother of Western culture. The implication is that since they once believed this, then it still must be a valid position to hold, regardless of any evidence that may have been discovered since then.
The colonial era in India continued, and it became increasingly clear to the Western mind that this connection with India was suspect to their own independence and also to the originality of their own thought. And so there was a gradual movement away from that and a projection of the idea that there was some earlier, what they called proto-indo-European languages, from which even Sanskrit derived, and actually, relative to one of perhaps the most ancient forms was actually German, much older than even the Sanskrit. So what happened was these languages became part of the German and the European nationalism of the 19th century.
There is no question that European Indological studies had its beginnings in the colonial period, and most certainly was colored by colonial interests. This is recognized by all. But is this sufficient cause to view with suspicion all theories from scholars today who happen to be from the West? I haven't psychoanalyzed the historians of 100 years ago, so I can't verify or deny what their motivations were for positing that there was a language older than Sanskrit. But I do know that European colonial ideology is not the reason historians hold such a position now, despite Frawley's implication. The common and current scholarly view that there is an Indo-European language family from which Sanskrit comes has never been seriously challenged by any linguistic or historical evidence. Now, it takes a while for Frawley to get to the actual evidence. He spends a long time at the beginning of his talk doing what we call poisoning the well. He gives this lengthy historical prologue in an effort to show that the Europeans had ulterior motives in propagating their various historical theories about India. He wants his audience to be so disgusted with the Europeans that by the time he gets to the evidence, they're already on his side and against the views that they perceive have come from Westerners. He's not propagating a conspiracy theory, but this is often how conspiracy theories are constructed. Criticize the prevailing view by making it sound as if people are deliberately deceiving you. So then you don't have to provide as much evidence for your own alternative hypothesis. In fact, you provide far less evidence for yours than the evidence that's presented for the consensus view. And that's what Frawley's doing here. But let's continue and I'll let you be the judge.
And along with that, the term Aryan was used to characterize not only these original languages, but the so-called original group of people, which were hypothesized in the beginning as an ethnicity, a race, even predominantly blonde-haired, blue-eyed people.
Fortunately, that is no longer the case.
As the colonial era developed, colonially funded government scholars came up with increasingly negative views of the Indian culture, its literature, and also its history and antiquity.
This indeed was racist and a travesty. Fortunately, this too is no longer the case. Unless, of course, Frawley thinks that denying Indian priority is a negative view, which he probably does.
And they brought in methods of interpretation that were outside of the Indian tradition and even contrary to what the Indian tradition said. Their main focus was the older Vedic text, namely the Rig Veda, and their main tool of approaching Rig Veda was their own tools of comparative European mythology, which they called, and of course linguistic studies. And their conclusion was that the Vedas resembled the old folk literature of Europe, and they must have been developed in Europe or Central Asia and brought in and imposed upon the people of India.
Notice here Frawley's negative portrayal of outside views. They're foreign and therefore yucky. What he calls outside views is just generally accepted scholarly methods of studying all civilizations, instead of what he supports, reconstructing history through religious interpretation of Indian sacred texts. So the choice before historians is either to be consistent in the way they study world civilizations, or to be inconsistent and apply different principles in their study of India, principles that would favor Indian traditions over all others. What to you seems more reasonable?
And along with that, Proto-Indo-European idea was that these languages then could not have arisen in India. They must have come from Central Asia, and their original culture would have been primitive, nomadic people, and later warrior people who with horses and chariots spread their languages throughout the various cultures of the world.
No historian today believes that Indian culture derived from nomadic, primitive people of Central Asia. Their view instead is that Indian culture grew out of the interaction between indigenous peoples of South Asia and the various groups of people that migrated into it over the centuries. None of them are considered, quote, primitive, unquote. Historians don't even use that word anymore.
In fact, you can read it very clearly in Monier Williams' very nice Sanskrit-English dictionary. In his own introduction, which is there, he says, we're doing this so that we can show what Indian thought really is and allow people to convert to Christianity. We will show the superiority of our Christian ideas. At that time, there was nothing hidden about these ideas. The colonial agenda, the missionary assault on India, and the rest of the world, the non-Christian world, was in full swing, had support from all the churches, it had support from the governments.
It is true that in his Sanskrit dictionary, Monier Williams, in the second edition of 1899, did write in his preface that the reason why he had taught Sanskrit all these years was because he had wanted the Bible to be translated into Sanskrit so that Christianity could be preached to the people of India. He's even more explicit in his recommendation of Christian evangelism in his book on Hinduism. I expect he would have pushed Christian evangelization no matter what the prevailing theory was. Yet Frawley is using Williams as an example to demonstrate that the intention specifically of this historical theory was to show the superiority of Christianity, which doesn't entirely make sense the way Frawley is expressing it, if, as he said earlier, these historians of the past argued that Indian culture derived from the Aryans, who were related to the Europeans. Why then would Europeans think that Aryan culture was inferior? And what does it have to do with Christianity, since Christianity didn't exist back then? He loses me there. I have no doubt that white Europeans used history to propagate their prejudices. But Frawley seems to be confusing bad interpretations of history with bad history. He's working under an assumption that if a historical theory is used for dishonorable purposes, that makes the theory wrong. Or that means the theory was invented for such dishonorable purposes and therefore cannot be factual. But you and I both know that people with bad intentions can use even sound historical facts for bad ends by interpreting such facts in a twisted manner. So the truth or falsehood of a historical claim cannot be determined merely by who says it, why they say it, or how it is interpreted. The claim itself needs to be examined for accuracy.
They rejected Indian interpretation of history altogether, anything more than before the time of Buddha.
Well, let's be fair here. What they did is treat the myths and legends of India the same way they treated the myths and legends of all civilizations. And if they weren't completely consistent then, they are now.
Now, at that time, there was not much archaeological work having been done in India. So they came to the conclusion that these Vedic Indo-European people, who were likely blonde-haired and blue-eyed, came into India around 1500 BC and civilized what had been a very primitive culture of basically aboriginal people.
First he says that European scholars taught that Aryans were nomadic primitives, and now he says that European scholars said Aryans civilized Aboriginal Indians. Were Aryans primitive or civilized?
Some even went further and said that there were no cities or civilization in India before the time of Alexander.
That is no longer the case, so...
The other interesting thing about the Aryans in Europe, it allowed groups like the Germans to connect back to their own older mythology and dissociate with Christianity and Judaism as their origins.
Hold on. Didn't he just say the theory was used to show the superiority of Christianity? Now he's saying it was used to dissociate from Christianity. Which is it?
Then, in the 20th century, archaeologists began to find significant urban ruins in India, largely near the Indus River, which they call the Indus Valley Civilization, they named after the two main cities they discovered, Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. Curiously, this dated from the 3rd millennium BC, which was 1,000 up to 2,000 years earlier than they were willing to allow civilization as having existed in India. And then, of course, it contradicted their Aryan theory, because the India was civilized then. It wasn't civilized by the Aryans coming in. So they reinvented the Aryans as the destroyers of the Indus Valley culture, and turned them from the bringers of civilization to the destroyers of civilization.
So here we now come to the Aryan invasion theory, first popularized by Mortimer Wheeler, which is that the Aryans, entering India, massacred the populations of the Indus River Valley or Harappan civilization, and took over. This theory is the one that Frawley claims to be taking issue with, even though scholars abandoned this view a long time ago. The current consensus view, the Aryan migration theory, leaves this conquest, this clash of two races, out of it. It holds that the Aryans simply migrated into India and intermingled with the local populations. There was no mass invasion, and they were not responsible for the destruction of the Harappan civilization. Keep in mind here that when the Harappan civilization was discovered, the old view that South Asia had no great civilization before the 1st millennium BCE was discarded. Historians now accepted that indigenous South Asians formed a great urban society. The fact that scholars have changed their views when discovering new evidence shows their willingness to learn and go where the evidence takes them. Indeed, historians and archaeologists are the ones who sought out the facts on their own and altered their views without anyone forcing them to do so. They were not without bias, of course, but their willingness to adjust their views is a testament to their overall honesty and devotion to accuracy. And historians continue to revise their ideas as more evidence comes in. More recently, for example, they've concluded that agriculture was invented in South Asia independently and was not learned from the outside. The process never ends. And I must say, it stands in stark contrast to Frawley's position that the Hindu view has been right since the beginning and can never be questioned, no matter what evidence is presented.
One of the archaeologists, Wheeler, concurred, and he piled a bunch of skeletons together and said this is proof of the Aryans having killed everybody.
Wheeler's biggest critics were and continue to be his fellow archaeologists. There are always going to be dishonest actors. The good news is that they will get called out by their colleagues if they try to pull the wool over people's eyes.
And this theory was then ingrained in textbooks throughout the world, and you can still find it in many textbooks throughout the world.
If textbooks do not accurately summarize the state of the field, that's the fault of the textbook writers, not the state of the field.
One thing we must remember, the ability to find sites archaeologically and the ability to interpret them are two totally different skills. The fact that Wheeler was one of the first people to find the sites does not mean that his interpretation of them had to be correct. They are not related skills at all. Archaeologists can show ruins. They are not necessarily qualified to interpret them, and these archaeologists had no training in the Indian tradition.
Archaeologists aren't qualified to interpret the sites they find, but apparently religious leaders are.
After the independence of India, The leftist, predominantly Marxist, took over the historical department. Marx was against the traditional culture of India, and he tried to turn class war theory of Europe into caste war theory of India. And the Marxists had invested themselves in the Aryan invasion theory, as the Aryan is the foreign white-skinned casteist people who impose themselves upon the country. So when these discoveries started to come out, the Marxists were quite upset. It went against their theories, so they tried to discredit them. They tried to say that these people who brought out these theories were Hindu fundamentalists.
Frawley implies that he is not a Hindu fundamentalist. What are his views exactly on the origins of Indian civilization? I've read his book, Gods, Sages, and Kings. Let me fill you in a bit more. Maybe you can tell Frawley is a proponent of the out of India theory, which he believes is far more reasonable than the mainstream view of history. According to this view, which is based on Hindu sacred texts, South Asia, not Mesopotamia, was where civilization began. And India, not the Middle East, invented agriculture first. Human beings are, in his view, the descendants of Shraddhadeva Manu, the Indian Noah, who survived a great flood at the end of the last ice age and whose boat landed in the Himalayas. Frawley believes that the Aryan or Vedic people are descendants of Manu's son Nahusha. They entered North India from the Himalayas 8,000 years ago, and after that, his descendants spread to other countries, taking their language with them. And all this information was gleaned from Hindu religious texts. There was, in his view, an Aryan revolt that occurred within India, through which a, quote, spiritually fallen, unquote, culture was overthrown. The Aryan priests, or Brahmins, had special occult knowledge that enabled them to control the forces of nature. Yeah, Frawley's claims don't sound Hindu fundamentalist at all, do they? The Rig Veda, oldest book of South Asian spiritual literature, he says, has its origins as far back as 6,000 BCE. The other Vedas, he believes, are a product of the early Harappan or Indus River Valley civilization, which existed circa 3300 to 1900 BCE. This places these books many centuries earlier, and in the case of the Rig Veda, thousands of years earlier, than they are dated by most historians of India. Near the end of his talk, Frawley goes into this whole excursus about how all the different cultures of the world owe many of their ideas to the Indians. Whether it be the ancient Greeks or the Egyptians or the Chinese, everybody. Even the Druids of Britain. There's clearly no doubt who he thinks is the supreme culture and who is inferior. To him, whatever is derived is inferior. But now what about his claim that mainstream Indian historians are all Marxists? I'm assuming when he says Marxists, he's talking about members of the two communist parties in India, the CPI and the CPIM. I don't know much about that, nor am I interested in it. I prefer to stick to academic discourse. I just am very skeptical of this kind of argument, because time and time again I see it misused. I hear people say, "Oh, you're just saying that because you're a..." fill in the blank. Frawley complained about it being used on people who hold his view, but he turns around and uses the same kind of argument against his own opponents. In other words, he thinks it's wrong for someone to say, "Oh, you're just saying that because you're a Hindu fundamentalist." But then he says, "Oh, you're just saying that because you're a Marxist." I think it's reasonable to claim that someone's biases are negatively affecting their logical reasoning, particularly when you're engaging with an individual whose biases are clear. But if you use it as a blanket condemnation of all your opponents by merely assuming their biases exist without demonstrating them, that's disingenuous. Has he demonstrated that all modern Indian scholars who hold to the theory of Aryan migration are Marxists? Or is he just making unsubstantiated accusations to poison the well? Near the end of his talk, Frawley suggests an approach that I agree with.
So we have to produce the evidence. We don't need to be emotional about it.
Yes, I agree. Let's leave the politics out of this and discuss it rationally. That would make me very happy.
we can bring out some of the political ramifications, but it's interesting. No theory in the history of the world has been used for more political advantage and destruction than this theory. And yet when Hindu groups or even non-Hindu groups question the Aryan movement into India, they are called politically biased and fundamentalist, whereas the Nazis, the Marxists, the Dravidian nationalists, Russian, German nationalists have all used this theory for political mileage. It does have political ramifications, but really not much.
Okay, well, if there aren't that many political ramifications, can we please stop talking about it?
There's only one country in the world where Marxists are still writing or determining textbooks. That is in India. They never did a good job anywhere else, even in the countries that they rule. They're even much worse in the countries that they rule. Why would you think that they've done a good job in India? India is a spiritual country. Marxists or atheists, we know. They have their own political agenda. Why should they be given that? The Marxist era ended in 1991. We no longer need Brenda Carrot and Sitaram Yechuri and these people telling us what to do and what is humanism, and we don't need their lackeys in television dictating morality in India and telling us who are the biased people. Nowhere in the world did the Marxists produce an objective view of history. They destroyed art, they destroyed culture. Marxists destroyed more of native Chinese culture than the British did, and Marxists have discredited more of the native Indian culture even than the British did.
Even though Frawley has injected politics into his purportedly academic talk, let's set his political rants aside and maintain some neutrality as we focus on the actual historical arguments. So, back to his introduction.
No evidence of any such invasion has been found. So then they decided to reinvent the theory as an Aryan migration theory. These Aryans migrated in, and they didn't actually disrupt the culture. The problem is, and there was no evidence of migration either.
Notice how Frawley gave a lengthy introduction to a theory that scholars today do not hold. He set it up as a straw man so that he could knock it down. And then here he does a quick bait and switch, substituting the new theory for the old one. He refers to the common scholarly view today and acts as if it is no different than the theory he just discredited. This is a common tactic that those like Frawley use, conflating the old Aryan invasion theory with the current Aryan migration theory deliberately, so that people, confused, will assume that all the problems associated with the former also apply to the latter. Mind you, there is some overlap. The invasion theory assumed migration, but please note that the migration theory doesn't assume an invasion. Neither does it imply that indigenous Indians were inferior to the migrants, or vice versa. He says there's no evidence of migration. Is he correct on that point? Let's take a look.
So genetically speaking, there were some early genetic studies. They tried to twist and say that Indian population has a lot of genes from Central Asia. But the more recent genetic study shows that is not the case. There was more of an outflow of genetic information from India out. There is no inflow of populations in this time of this so-called Aryan invasion, Aryan migration at all.
Yeah, guess what? While it is true that data on matrilineal DNA suggests little external infusion into the South Asian gene pool within the last 12,500 years, data from patrilineal DNA indicates that about 17.5% of Indian male lineage belongs to haplogroup R1a, which at the time we are talking about was spread across Eurasia. But while some speculated that perhaps R1a originated in India, recent research has shown this to be highly unlikely. Why? Because there is less diversity in the R1a lineages in India, and we would expect the opposite, more diversity in a place of origin. That means that the R1a haplogroup came into India, and genetic scientists have been able to narrow down the timing of this influx to around 4,500 to 4,000 years ago, so around 2,500 to 2,000 BCE. Two recent genetic studies done by a team from the Harvard Medical School, including the largest ever study of ancient DNA, which was published this year, have established that Indo-European languages originated in the Eurasian steppes among pastoralists who moved west toward Europe almost 5,000 years ago, and then spread back eastward into Central and South Asia in the following 1,500 years. Evidence further indicated that the Indus River Valley civilization was formed by the primary ancestral populations of South Asia and some people from other places, including Southeast Asia and Iran, at a time before there was a significant influx of DNA from the Eurasian steppes. I'll leave links for all this below the video.
So the only card they have left to prove Aryan invasion migration is what they call the linguist card. They claim that the languages of India came in from Central Asia and are connected because of their connection with Iranian and other languages. But actually, if we look at language, that is not the case. Let's look at indo-European languages. We have related languages of French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese. Why? Because there were migrating nomads who took these languages to different places? No, because there's a dominant Latin Roman culture that ruled these areas and passed on their languages. So in history, we've had very powerful, besides spoken languages, we have lingua francas. We have languages of trade, we have languages of ruling states and languages of empire, languages of literature, languages of religion. This is what has allowed language to spread, not primitive people simply moving with their languages.
No one is saying that the migrants were primitives or a subject culture. The theory says that many of the migrant groups came to dominate in the area, and therefore their language was preserved and passed on.
And we also have a very good criticism of the whole linguistic theory of human culture. Culture and language is usually not the same. For example, in Europe, there are also people speaking non-Indo-European languages that are part of European culture. So the ability of languages to be spread or language families to exist doesn't rest upon migration of primitive people. It rests upon some elite predominance and dominant culture.
He's right. Culture and language are not the same. I mean, language is a part of culture, but there's a lot more to culture than that. And historians trace not only the spread of languages, but also the spread of cultures. It is interesting that the Aryans, while passing on their language, did not pass on other aspects of their culture as much, but rather began to be affected by and adopt much of the local culture when they settled there. We see the same with, say, the Mongol Empire later in history. That is why we observe continuity over time in the South Asian archaeological record. So historians definitely do not equate language and culture. But I should point out that this idea is important to Frawley, because he believes that India spawned all other civilizations, not just the ones in the same language family. Thus, he can argue that cultural similarities between India and other lands is because India is the originator of these cultural ideas. In his book, for example, he claims that the Egyptians got their solar religion from the Indians, and their veneration of the falcon, spotted cow, and lotus. In other words, even though the Egyptians had falcons, spotted cows, lotuses, and the sun in their land, they couldn't have thought of venerating such things on their own. Oh no, they needed the Indians to teach it to them. We have to be careful with these kinds of correlations, because similarity alone does not indicate causation. There have to be other evidences in order to support and corroborate such conclusions.
Throughout history, the majority of people have spoken more than one language. So to identify people by one language is absurd. And to identify culture and ethnicity by language is absurd.
While we can certainly acknowledge that many children grow up bilingual, the vast majority of humans on the planet have a primary language. It is therefore not absurd to identify a people according to their primary language. If I speak historically of, say, the Greeks, what I mean is the people whose primary language was Greek. By saying that, I am not denying the possibility that a Greek may have known more than one language. Just like the dominant Hellenistic Greeks imposed Greek as the lingua franca of the regions they ruled over, while at the same time the people living under them could have spoken their own local languages, so too in India. And specifically, we're talking about northern India, where the Aryans became dominant, and therefore their language, Sanskrit, became the language of government and business and religion and literature, but the people still spoke their local indigenous languages.
In fact, we can make a good case that because India had such a strong culture, that it influenced, like the predominance of Latin, Greek, and others, it influenced other cultures in various directions.
What does Frawley mean when he says India's culture was so strong? I don't even know what culture strength is. How is this strength manifested? How do you measure it? What is India's strength measurement in comparison with other cultures? What is his evidence for that? Is he talking about military strength? As it stands, it's just a vague claim. The fact is, history has demonstrated that languages are not passed on based on the quality of the language itself. Many great languages are now extinct, and many languages you would never think would survive have. They're passed on because of who speaks them and where they happen to be and where they happen to go. Sometimes it's just good happenstance.
And the fact is, as the oldest and most sophisticated of the Indo-European languages, it's the most in need of a great civilization to sustain it.
Here he seems to be assuming the great age of the Vedic language in order to demonstrate that the Vedic language is old. Or if we assume that it is old, therefore it must be the oldest language. And I should add, arguing that something must be the oldest because it is the most sophisticated doesn't coincide with everything we know about history, where things often get more sophisticated as time passes.
The whole Vedic literature could only have existed if there was the large state machinery to maintain it. There needed to be the instrumentality of a state to continue so many different branches of knowledge, so many different recensions of the Vedas, and so many different types of vidyas going along with it. In fact, every aspect of the vidyas were there: architecture, music, dance, philosophy, religion, medicine, and so forth. All of these are under the broader umbrella of the Vedas.
We're not really disagreeing about whether there needed to be mechanisms in place by which this literature could be transmitted and preserved. We're disagreeing about when this was. That is, when the Vedas achieved their final form. And I should add that very strong and powerful states can exist without brick or stone buildings. That seems to confuse a lot of people.
There are instances where languages come in and the population doesn't change. But there is nothing as radical as the case of India. And in those cases, the earlier languages, earlier place names, etc., are known. In northern India, there are no pre-Sanskritic place names at all, of rivers and other things.
Okay. So today, thousands of years later, there are no non-Sanskritic place names that have survived in northern India. But in the Rig Veda, when it is said that the Aryans encounter foreign people, the Dasyu, many of these people have non-Sanskritic names. These encounters between Sanskrit-speaking people and non-Sanskrit-speaking people took place in India. Indeed, Frawley believes the Rig Veda was composed in India. How does he explain this? And why does he think the absence of non-Sanskritic names today is more significant than the presence of non-Sanskritic names back then? One of the important things to remember about language is that when we find words or features of an existing language that do not conform to its present grammatical or word structure and have no clear etymology or origin, that can mean only one of two things. Either that the anomalous word or feature was borrowed from someone else's language, or that it came from a preceding other language. In the Rig Veda, there are all kinds of non-Sanskrit words, including names for local plants and animals, a large number of agricultural terms, and local river names. This indicates that the Sanskrit-speaking composers of the Rig Veda picked up vocabulary from non-Sanskrit-speaking people in India, people who already had names for their rivers, their plants, and their animals. If the Sanskrit-speaking composers of the Rig Veda were indigenous to India, they would have Sanskrit names for such rivers, plants, and animals. But they don't.
There's still some of this linguistic argument that's hard to deal with because they change the rules of the game when they no longer win the game.
Historical linguistics is a science, and as such it is refined over time. Rules aren't changing, understanding is improving. The methodology used for studying the Indo-European languages is the same that is used for all the languages of the whole world. There are no special rules for India. It's the same for everyone. Frawley, you see, does not like the egalitarian approach. He wants science and history to treat India preferentially.
And people can invent more than one language. Ancient people were multilingual. They could also have more than one language. We have been laboring under wrong ways of knowledge. These things like comparative mythology and linguistics prove the theories of the people who have invented these systems of knowledge. And without hard evidence, they have no basis.
I have to ask Mr. Frawley why he thinks languages come into being. He seems to be saying that a people who have a perfectly adequate form of communication would invent new languages just because they feel like it? Or that people of a single profession would say, hey, let's make up a language for our profession. Most languages aren't invented. They evolve over time, and older languages slowly turn into new ones, or they are influenced by neighboring languages. In order to maintain his view of Indian priority and superiority, he's willing to throw an entire field of study into the trash bin.
It's very important that we emphasize the geological and the archaeological evidence first, because that is very solid. Even the genetic evidence is pretty good. Literary evidence is also in our favor.
As we have seen, the genetic evidence is not in his favor. The linguistic evidence is not in his favor. On two fronts, he fails. But Frawley says priority should be given to geological, archaeological, and literary evidence. So in part 2 of this video series, we'll meet him where he feels strongest. We'll give due consideration to his geological, archaeological, and literary arguments. Maybe, with powerful evidence and good reasoning, he'll be able to convince us. Time will tell. If you want to see how all this plays out, please click on the little bell next to the subscribe button, and you'll be notified when the video is posted. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.